What up, bye babes? Okay, so today's video is going to be the pros and cons of me growing up Christian and bisexual. I grew up in Queens, New York, and I was raised by two Nigerian parents, so I am Nigerian American. And I learned as I was growing up that there was really no separation between like religion and ethnic identity. And so the majority of the time that I was around other Nigerians, it was usually in church settings, it was usually in like very traditional settings like weddings and things like that. And so I learned from a very early age that there wasn't going to be a separation between me learning about what it meant to be Nigerian and me learning about Christianity. So I grew up loosely Christian. My parents would take me to church, every Sunday or every other Sunday. But I wasn't really like super into it until I was about like 14. And from the age of 14 till 22, roughly, I was like a Christian, very devout. Sometimes I would go to church 3 times a week. I was very, very involved. So one of the pros is that at a very early age, I was exposed to reading the Bible. And there are beautiful similes and beautiful metaphors in the Bible, and the language is just very sort of dense in certain places. And so that exposed me to a whole other world that maybe I wouldn't have been exposed to until a little later on. So reading the Bible, which I read about maybe like 85% of the entire Bible, reading so much sort of dense material really expanded my mind and my vocabulary and got me used to reading text from way back. So when I came up on Shakespeare in high school, I mean, it was still, tough, but it wasn't like, oh, I've never heard of anything like this before, So I was sort of like familiar with being able to decipher and read and break down various kinds of text. So that was like a huge pro for me. So now on to a con. One of the cons for me was I would do what I was told. I would do what was in the Bible, but not necessarily because I believed that it was the right thing to do, but I did so because it had consequences. Oh, if you don't do this, you're going to go to hell. If you don't do this, that means you're sinning. Outwardly, I was performing these things, but internally, that wasn't really what I agreed with. That wasn't exactly what my personal set of values were. My set of personal values and ethics were being sort of like shaped by what I was reading, by the people that I was around, by Christianity as a religion. And so that sort of disconnect was like a huge con, and it's something that I had to wait until after I came out of the religion to really sort of start to examine doing the right thing because I believe that it's the right thing to do. Not because there's going to be a punishment, not because I'm looking for a reward, but doing the right thing because I believe it's the right thing to do. It's good that I'm talking about this stuff now because it was an opportunity for me to really refine what my politics and what my belief system was after I left the religion. And that was like really trying, but also really like empowering because I get to decide what I believe. I get to decide what I think is right and wrong. So a pro is that being a Christian kept me away from it kept me away from getting somebody pregnant. It kept me out of situations where I would be having sex, condomless sex. Though at the same time, there were slip-ups. There were incidents that were completely unplanned, and I was so sort of hot and heavy, if you will, that I wasn't really thinking and I wasn't really prepared because in my mind it was like, no sex until marriage. And since I'm not having sex, I don't need condoms. Since I'm not having sex, I don't really need to understand how STIs work because I'm not gonna do that anyway. So in these instances where I was just like in the heat of the moment, or it was just these random little incidents, I wasn't prepared with condoms. So it's kind of like a pro and a con, right? So it kept me out of those situations in general. It kept me away from having sex and getting someone pregnant and things like that. But once in a while I would slip up. And it only takes one time to contract HIV or other STIs. It only takes one time to get pregnant. So, and that kind of leads me into this next pro or con, I'm not sure which one this is, but long stints of celibacy. So the plan was to wait until I got married to a woman. So I was celibate for long stints of time, years at a time. I think the longest I've ever been celibate was maybe something like 4 years, 5 years, something like that. A long sense of time. Even to this day, I'm no longer a Christian, yet and still my default is to just sort of like be celibate. My default is to like sort of like neglect in a way my sexual life and my sexual sort of like health. Because I think it is healthy to have sex. Well, not that I think, it is. It is proven. It's good for you in terms of like emotionally and physically and all of that stuff. It's good for you. Even though I'm not a Christian now and I haven't been in like over 8 years, I found myself feeling frustrated about that. I was a Christian during these very developmental years of my life. So I'm still challenging that and still like changing it, but in terms of like what my defaults are and what is sort of like comfortable, it kind of always has this like sort of conservative tilt to it. Okay, next is another con. This con is being like stunted or delayed in certain regards. Now, I think part of this is because I was a Christian, and I also recognize that part of it is just like a queer thing. I'm bi, and I know many other bi people have similar experiences to me. I was a Christian throughout high school and college. During these years is when people are experimenting sexually, romantically, in social ways too. And I always had limits for myself. I always had limits of what things that I would be a part of, what events I would allow myself to go to, what TV shows I would watch, what music I would listen to. And so it was like this sort of like sheltered in a way, like growing up an experience, even though I'm from New York, even this big city, and it's seen as like this crazy place. My experience wasn't really like that. I wasn't trying drugs. I wasn't experimenting with the world around me. I wasn't really engaging in every single way I could, right? And so what that left me with after I was no longer a Christian is I realized that in certain regards, I was really stunted. I hadn't had experiences, various like relationships that I was in. And so being a person in my mid to early 20s, trying to like negotiate all of that, trying to be in relationships kind of like for the first time, I noticed a huge gap between myself and people around my age, my peers. I felt like I was just like way more adolescent than they were and way less experienced than they were in so many regards. I noticed like this shyness within myself that still persists to this day around men, around women, around non-binary people. And I feel as though some of that would have been exercised, if you will, back when I was like a teenager, back when I was in college, like that nervousness, that shyness, that hesitancy. A lot of that would have like happened when I was in high school. And similarly to like a lot of other queer people who had this experience too of just kind of being like delayed and stunted. Our first crushes weren't celebrated by our parents, right? Depending on the gender of your crush, or certain relationships, certain things like being in high school and like dating somebody for like 2 weeks and then you just break up and it's like, it's not a big deal, but you learn a little bit more about yourself or learn a little bit more about the other person, and then you keep going and then maybe something else happens with someone else, and then so on and so on, and you start to mature. But many queer people don't get to have these little like crushes or these little romantic experiences or these little things that are celebrated by the larger society. So a lot of us don't actually get to start dating or experimenting or loving our sexuality until we're in our late 20s or late 30s or late 40s or late 50s or 60s, etc. So it's this kind of like delayed thing. I know part of that is because I am bi, but part of that is certainly because I was also Christian and I was very regimented about like certain things that I would allow myself to participate in. So that is a con that still plagues me to this day, but I'm working through it. Another con that I wanted to talk about, because I've never really heard anybody speak about this before, but while I was a Christian, I was trying to like pray the gay away. I was trying to really push down my attraction and my interest in men, really trying to beef up my attraction to women, and putting so much pressure on your sexuality is just like, it's really unhealthy, and only celebrating your attraction to a particular gender is really unhealthy. And I think there's this perception that bisexual people's sexuality is like split. It's this attraction to a gender similar to yours and attraction to a gender different from yours. But it's not like that for me. It's not these two separate things that exist in isolation. It's this one sexuality. If I'm getting messages from larger society that my attraction to men is the problem, my attraction to men and women and other people is all one thing. It's not this split thing. And so if I am internalizing messages that there is something wrong with my attraction to men, there is something wrong with my sexuality, because it's a whole thing. So the feelings of like guilt and shame and disgust that I had concerning my attraction to men that I internalized from a larger society and from Christianity affected my entire sexuality, affected my entire self-esteem. And the con that I'm getting to is that while I was in church, it was like seen as like everybody has their cross to bear. So this is my cross that I have to bear, being bisexual, being attracted to men. But I just need to keep praying and keep fasting and pray the gay away, right? But in church, even though there was this attitude of like, oh yeah, everybody sins, blah, 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 there was still like this sort of like hierarchy of like, oh well, this sin is like this sin is like this. And socially, I just noticed that like nobody really wanted to be too close to me or really wanted to be my friend. There were a few women who would befriend me and stuff like that, but certainly not many men would want to be around me. It was almost as though they thought that it was contagious, like a spirit was in me and could jump onto other people. And this idea of like bisexuality, homosexuality being contagious is something that I still see in media today. It's something that I still believed up until like a couple years ago, even though I was not a Christian a couple years ago. Like, it's so crazy how like these ideas really take hold of you and like really go deep in you, so that you feel as though you don't want to be around anybody, you don't want to like infect anybody else, you don't want to like infect people's kids, and you don't want to be around people because you're going to encourage them to be gay or to be bisexual. And these ideas are rampant in our society when you talk about things like the gay agenda or whatever. Like, it's these ideas, and that is a huge con because it took a toll on my self-esteem. And just being a Christian, it wasn't this open arm embrace experience for me. I felt always like a little bit on the outside. Even though I was like very devout, I kind of always felt like people kind of like looked at me like, yeah, like, let me not get too close, you know? I want to thank all of you for watching this, listening to me ramble on about my life. I actually want to hear about some of your experiences too. Did you grow up in an organized religion? Did you create a religion on your own or a spiritual practice on your own? Are you an atheist? Are you agnostic? What's up? Let's talk about it.